Becca and I in our morning Bible readings have been going through the early sections of Acts this week. And we came to Acts 4, Peter and John before the Sanhedrin. It's a famous piece, and I've certainly read it before, but there were a couple of things that struck me this week in particular. The first bit is that Peter and John are coming out of what we could, I suppose, call their own mini lockdown. They've been in prison. They're brought before the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin tell them to stop preaching the gospel, and Peter and John refuse. The question that brought to my mind was us and the gospel as we come out of lockdown. Peter spoke about it this morning, Pete Byram this morning, in his prayers, some of the questions that face for us. I sort of get a sense in society and in the church that we don't all want things to go back to the way that they were before. And certainly over the next weeks and months, with social distancing and restrictions, that can't happen. So it does raise a question for us. What is the gospel going forward for us? How do we meet on a Sunday morning? Is that now the key to what we do, or is it, as it can sometimes be, a bit of a side issue, something that we concentrate on instead of the gospel? Numbers will be restricted at churches. How will we do communion? Those questions are in our mind, but also the questions of mission are there for us. What will the missional opportunities be? How will we do mission? How does that fit with our worldview? These are questions that we're asking in the Vine. These are questions that are being asked across the church. And I think we will discuss them more and more over the next few weeks. Peter and John certainly came out all guns blazing, if we can say that phrase. They were standing in front of the Sanhedrin declaring Jesus, it says, which is right in God's eyes, to listen to you or to him. For us, we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard. But the other part that spoke to me this week, and was something that I was considering anyway. Here in this passage, I looked at the Sanhedrin as power. Now, power tries to maintain the status quo. They want to maintain the narrative. And as Peter and John are brought before them, the Sanhedrin in their seat of power recognise that change is coming through the gospel. And they don't want it to, so they threaten and they threaten and they try to repress. Peter and John are having none of it. Around the world at the moment, protest is happening. There's Black Lives Matter protests. Unfortunately, even yesterday, there were violent protests against those sort of demonstrations. Statues have been toppled. Now, I'm a white, middle-class, liberal, fairly a little bit left of centre male. It's quite difficult for me to speak about white privilege, about white power, because that's where I sit, inevitably because of my upbringing. Because of who I am, I sit in that position of power. But I absolutely recognise that something is going on here and something needs to change. Back in the 80s, we stood at kick out racism. Racism is still prevalent in our society, and it's something that we should stand against, I believe. My own son lives in South Carolina, and last week's service on a Sunday evening was a 2-hour question and answer session with some black men from the church being asked some questions about how they felt, and they were fairly direct. It was quite moving. The gospel brings a challenge to power. We see this here with Peter and John. Of course, the gospel is one of reconciliation, of forgiveness, of grace. But during this pandemic, and in society before the pandemic, we've found that BAME lives seem to have mattered less. We've looked at the situation where the underprivileged have suffered more during the pandemic. That's because of inequality in our society. And for me, the gospel speaks to this. The gospel speaks to the power structure, the status quo, and says this should not continue. The gospel questions that. The gospel speaks for the orphan, for the widow, for the downcast, for those that need to be lifted up. And that is true not just in songs that we sing, but it's true about our society. So as we come out of lockdown, I think we need to ask the question is, how does the gospel move forward from here? How does the gospel stand against power that needs to be changed? How does the gospel stand against the inequalities, the injustices in this society and the wider society? I shared these thoughts with Andy Weir, and Andy Weir is wise and said to me, yes, Paul, I understand the point you're making and I agree with the point you're making. Just have a little look further down, Acts, and see how Peter and John react. Verse 23, on their release, Peter and John went back to their own people and reported all the chief priests and the elders had said to them. In verse 29, now, Lord, consider their threats and enable your servants to speak your word with great boldness. Peter and John stood against power. They looked it straight in the eye and said, we want change. And when they were released, they went back to their own people and they reported to them and they prayed and they brought themselves back under the plumb line of God. And that is important for us. As we stand against injustice, as we proclaim this gospel, it's important that we do that under the plumb line of God. That we always check with God where we are. But it's something more than that as well, I think. I think we need to address the power within ourselves. We need to look within ourselves and check that we, in our own hearts, are also checking with God. That we allow the Holy Spirit to speak to us. What are the power bases within us? What's the power bases within you, Paul, that God needs to look at, that you try to hide away, that need to be changed, so that we can speak this gospel with integrity? We've allowed God to move in us, to seek our hearts, to refine us, so that as we stand against injustice, as we stand with humility, with grace, with love, with peace, as we work for forgiveness, that we've used those same things in our own lives by God's Holy Spirit. The agendas in society are changing. There are discussions this week about violence against women, about gender issues. The gospel speaks to all of these. Now, I don't have the answers to all of those, but I know there are questions that are not going away. We need to look at ourselves, to judge our own hearts, to allow God to judge our hearts, so that we can work with people and groups in this world to bring a more equal and a more just and a more loving and, a more God-centered society.